Margaret Winters adjusted her glasses as she scanned the reference desk, watching the afternoon bustle of Somerset County Library unfold before her. The soft autumn light filtered through the tall windows, casting a warm glow over the ancient oak shelves that had been her domain for nearly 15 years. In her hands, she held a stack of worn index cards, not security clearance files, not intelligence reports, not even a secure satellite phone. Just outdated index cards marked Overdue Notices in faded blue ink. That was her assignment for the day. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Overdue notice duty. The thought made her lips tighten, but she kept her expression pleasant and grandmotherly. "Hey, Maggie," called out Brad Thompson from behind the circulation desk, his voice carrying that particular mix of condescension and forced politeness that had become all too familiar. "The new library director's got you chasing down late books again, huh? Hope you don't strain your hip." "That's some serious responsibility there," his colleague, Amber Wilson, chuckled without looking up from her phone. "Maybe they'll promote you to senior card catalog custodian next." Margaret didn't respond. She'd learned months ago that defending herself only made things worse. Instead, she adjusted her cardigan and gazed at the newly installed digital archives system sitting unused in the research alcove. Its sleek terminals and powerful database software dominated the space. The system was fully operational, updated and ready, just like she was. But neither of them had been cleared for proper use. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had more experience with advanced information systems than the entire library staff combined. She knew every database, every search algorithm, every security protocol. During the recent county-wide staff development workshops, she'd quietly outperformed younger colleagues, earning puzzled looks from instructors who couldn't reconcile her age with her expertise. But when it came to actual implementation of the new system, she was always assigned to peripheral tasks, a polite way of saying she was benched. Director Elaine Crawford strode past without acknowledgement, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floor as she headed toward the administrative office where the real decisions were made. Margaret had tried to speak with her weeks ago about the assignment pattern, but Crawford brushed her off with vague comments about technological comfort zones and appropriate skill matching for senior staff. The afternoon light dimmed noticeably as a bank of clouds moved over the library. Through the windows, Margaret could see rain beginning to fall, droplets tracing down the glass like coded messages she'd once been trained to decipher. Inside, the library's younger staff members were gathered around the central desk, excitedly discussing the upcoming Digital Archives Symposium, an event Margaret had been told was probably too technical for her to attend. She turned to see Derek Chun approaching. The 35-year-old reference librarian was the only person on staff who'd ever shown her genuine respect. Derek was a military history enthusiast who'd worked with Margaret on several research projects and had witnessed her exceptional information retrieval skills firsthand. "This is ridiculous," Derek said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "You should be leading the digital archives transition, not sorting overdue notices." Margaret shrugged, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the index cards. "Orders are orders." "Bull," Derek whispered fiercely. "Everyone knows you're the best researcher we have. Remember the Alderson family genealogy project from last summer? You traced connections that professional historians missed." The memory hit Margaret like a physical blow. The Alderson project had been her moment to shine. A complex historical research challenge, involving fragmented records and conflicting sources that most archivists couldn't even comprehend, let alone untangle. She'd not only completed it flawlessly, but had also discovered previously unknown historical connections that changed how local historians viewed the county's founding. The report had been filed away and forgotten, labeled as interesting but excessively detailed by Director Crawford. That was just a routine genealogy request, Margaret said, though her voice lacked conviction. Research that might actually matter today, Derek replied, nodding toward the group of agitated staff members gathering near the director's office. Those old skills are exactly what we need, aren't they? Before Margaret could respond, Director Crawford emerged from her office with a sharp clap of her hands. The symposium preparation was officially launching. She watched as the first team of librarians huddled around Crawford, receiving their assignments with eager nods until they disappeared into the conference room. The second group followed moments later, clutching tablets and notebooks, faces bright with anticipation. Margaret checked her watch. The symposium was barely 3 weeks away, and preparations were already behind schedule. If the organizing teams couldn't get their presentations together, even the events already on the calendar might have to be canceled. She thought about the county officials and educational partners waiting for this symposium, counting on Somerset Library to showcase the future of digital archiving in rural communities. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You know what? The worst part is, she said to Derek, surprising herself with the bitterness in her voice, they'll blame the funding when this symposium fails. They'll write reports about resource limitations and technological challenges, but they won't mention that they left their best information specialists sorting overdue notices. Derek squeezed her shoulder. Maybe it's time to stop waiting for permission. The words hung in the air between them as another announcement from Director Crawford echoed through the library. The symposium schedule was proving more challenging than anticipated. The digital archives demonstration was officially in jeopardy. Margaret looked down at the index cards in her hands, then at the digital archive system sitting silent in the alcove. For the first time all afternoon, she smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "You're right," she said quietly. "Maybe it is." The rain intensified like a deliberate signal, drumming against the library roof in increments of increasing urgency. Margaret watched from her position near the reference desk as visibility through the windows dropped from clear to streaked gray. The afternoon light, already muted, disappeared entirely behind the darkening clouds that now pressed against the tall library windows. Inside the conference room, voices grew sharper and more urgent. Through the glass panels, she could see silhouettes gesturing over laptops and presentation boards. The symposium planning was falling apart in real time. "Initial data migration failing at 40%, announced a voice from inside the room. "Amber, what's your status?" A tense reply followed. "The metadata structure is inconsistent. We can't map the legacy catalog to the new system without losing critical classification data." Margaret's grip tightened on the index cards. She'd memorized every field in that legacy catalog, every classification anomaly, every data migration protocol. Not because anyone had asked her to, but because someone had to care about the details. Someone had to remember that behind every data point was a piece of history counting on them to preserve it correctly. "The Historical Society's collection is completely incompatible," came another voice. "We'll have to exclude it from the demonstration." The second team was hitting roadblocks too. Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. The symposium was supposed to showcase how small county libraries could preserve local history through digital means, and now they were considering abandoning the most important collection. Brad Thompson wandered past, shaking his head at the commotion from the conference room. "Well, that's that," he said to no one in particular. "No one's sorting through that metadata mess in time. Guess it's back to basics for everybody." His casual dismissal of the situation made Margaret's blood boil. This wasn't just a work project to her. This was history, real history that deserved to be preserved and made accessible. And now it was being abandoned because of technical challenges. that she knew could be navigated with the right approach. She thought about the classification system she'd developed during her years of intelligence work. The metadata wasn't random. It followed predictable patterns based on content origins and contextual relationships. There was a framework, maybe not immediately obvious to casual observers, but crystal clear to someone trained to see patterns in chaos. Winters. Director Crawford's voice cut through her thoughts. She was standing in the doorway of the conference room, her expression strained. Get me the final count on outstanding overdue notices. We need to update our community engagement metrics. Community engagement metrics? She was worried about overdue books when their digital future was imploding. Ma'am, there are approximately 87 outstanding notices across all patron categories, Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the frustration building inside her. All documented in the weekly report I submitted yesterday. Right. Include that in the quarterly summary. She turned to go back inside, then paused. And Winters, when you're done with those notices, you can head home early. We're having a technical staff meeting for the rest of the afternoon. The dismissal was casual, almost careless, like she was just another outdated system to be shut down when not needed. Margaret watched her disappear back into the conference room where the real librarians would discuss the situation and make the important decisions. Derek appeared at her elbow, his face flushed with concern. I just listened in on their migration planning, he whispered urgently. They're totally misunderstanding how the historical metadata needs to be preserved. They're going to lose crucial contextual relationships. Margaret's heart skipped. How bad is it? They're talking about flattening all the hierarchical relationships, eliminating half the cross-references. Margaret, they'll destroy 2 centuries of careful cataloging. Through the glass, Margaret could hear the distant sound of raised voices as the teams argued over technical specifications. The Digital Archives project was officially failing before it had really begun. In a few days, generations of historical connections would be lost in a report that blamed technical limitations for an unavoidable compromise, but it wasn't unavoidable. Not if someone was willing to take the risk. Margaret looked at the index, cards in her hands one more time, then deliberately set them down on a nearby desk. She'd been holding other people's decisions for too long. It was time to make her own. Derek, she said quietly, I need you to do something for me. Anything. In about 15 minutes, I need you to accidentally knock over that display of new acquisitions near the main desk. Make it look natural, but create enough of a distraction to draw attention away from the research alcove. Derek's eyes widened as he realized what Margaret was planning. Are you sure about this? If they catch you. They won't catch me, Margaret said with quiet confidence. I'll be done before they realize what happened. She turned toward the digital archive system, still sitting silent and ready in the research alcove. The powerful workstation seemed to be waiting for her, its presence both challenging and reassuring. She'd spent countless hours studying that system, learning every function, every command structure, every data relationship. The classification crosswalk, she continued. It's still in my personal notes. I verified it this morning during the system demonstration. The metadata structure is following the exact pattern I recognized from my intelligence work, but the relationship mapping is irrelevant if you know how to create the right transformation rules. Margaret's voice carried a certainty that surprised even her. I've designed similar systems conversion protocols dozens of times. I know every data type, every relationship model, every information preservation technique. The metadata isn't random, Derek. It's predictable. The teams in the conference room were breaking up now, their faces showing the strain of failed solutions and looming deadlines. In a few minutes, the library would be buzzing with frustrated staff members looking for someone to blame. The perfect time for one experienced information specialist to quietly take matters into her own hands. Margaret took a deep breath. feeling the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. For months, she'd been the perfect employee, following directions, accepting assignments, waiting for acknowledgement. But acknowledgement wasn't coming. It never had been. "You don't have to do this," Derek said softly. Margaret looked at her friend, then at the rain-streaked windows, then at the digital system waiting in the alcove. "Yes," she said quietly. "I do." An email notification chimed from the conference room computer. The voice that followed was fainter now, more desperate. "Director, this is the County Historical Society. The symposium materials aren't mapping correctly. We need immediate assistance with the archival integration." The only response was silence. Margaret was already walking toward the research alcove. The digital workstation felt different in the rain-muted light. Margaret moved through the narrow space between the terminals with practiced silence, her fingers barely making a sound on the keyboard. She'd been here countless times before during her lunch breaks, but never with this sense of purpose burning in her chest. At the administrator terminal, locked with a password she wasn't supposed to know, lay the data transformation tools. That could save the entire project. The password had been changed last month when Director Crawford decided the system was too sensitive for general staff access. The new credentials had been carelessly displayed on a post-it note during a staff meeting. Margaret had quietly memorized them, thinking someday they might be useful. Today was that day. The system unlocked with a soft beep. Inside, beneath layers of poorly organized file structures, was the metadata migration tool she needed. The interface looked complex to untrained eyes, but to Margaret, it was elegantly simple. It looked like nothing special, just another technical utility, but to her, it was a bridge between past and future. She navigated to the configuration settings, her fingers moving with the swift precision that had once broken through the most sophisticated encryption systems of the Cold War. The metadata transformation rules needed to be completely restructured. She opened the command line interface, something the younger staff avoided, and began writing custom scripts that would preserve the critical relationships. "Winters, you in there?" Margaret froze. It was Amber Wilson, her voice echoing from the main desk area. She quickly minimized the command window and opened a basic catalog search screen. "Yes, just checking a reference question," she called back, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "On what?" "Everyone's in the meeting. Patron request from this morning, something about local Civil War history." The lie came easily, wrapped in enough specificity to sound boring and routine. Amber appeared at the entrance to the alcove, her expression skeptical. "Director Crawford's looking for you. Something about those quarterly metrics." Quarterly metrics again, as if the impending loss of historical connections was less important than overdue notice statistics. "I'll be right there," Margaret said. But she made no move to leave the workstation. Instead, she pulled up a basic historical search on the screen. "Just need to finish this first." Amber shrugged and wandered off, apparently satisfied that the old librarian was busy with something appropriately mundane. Margaret waited until her footsteps faded before returning to the command interface. The data transformation script was taking shape, built on principles of information preservation she'd mastered decades ago in a very different context. She pulled up the sample data set and ran a test transformation. The results appeared instantly. Clean, properly related metadata with all hierarchical relationships intact. Her heart began to race with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. It was possible. Difficult, potentially career-ending if she was caught, but possible. Margaret closed the test environment and began implementing the solution across the entire system. The massive archive sat in the database like a sleeping giant, its information dormant, but ready. She'd examined the data structures during her unofficial investigations, going through every table with the same attention to detail she'd brought to every intelligence analysis. The system was sound, fully operational, all resources loaded and properly indexed. The only thing missing was the right approach to the migration. She worked swiftly, implementing transformation rules that would preserve every relationship, every context, every historical connection. The solution wasn't complicated once you understood how information related to other information, something Margaret had spent a lifetime mastering. Through the glass panels, she could see the frustrated staff members dispersing from the conference room, their faces showing the strain of failed solutions. Somewhere in those discussions, generations of careful historical cataloging were about to be sacrificed for expediency. Her hands moved across the keyboard, muscle memory guiding her through the implementation sequence. Not actually activating the full migration, not yet, but preparing everything so that when the time came, the transformation would be seamless. Winters. The voice echoed across the library, sharp with authority. Director Crawford was looking for her again, probably wondering why she hadn't reported for her quarterly metrics assignment. Margaret closed her eyes and took a deep breath. In a few minutes, she'd either be a hero or unemployed. There was no middle ground, no safe choice. That would let her sleep at night, knowing she'd had the chance to preserve crucial historical connections and chosen not to take it. She thought about the generations of librarians and historians who had carefully built these relationships between pieces of information, creating a web of knowledge that the official channels had decided was too complicated to maintain. They deserved better than a bureaucratic decision made by people who'd never understood the patterns, never seen the connections, never grasped that sometimes the too complicated was just another word for worth preserving. Another email notification chimed from the conference room computer. The message preview was visible from where she sat. Director Crawford, the county commissioners are concerned about the symposium demonstration. Please provide immediate update on archive integration status. The response was being drafted, full of technical limitations and adjusted expectations. Margaret opened her eyes and looked out at the rain-streaked windows. The system's processors were humming softly beneath her hands. All she had to do was execute the script and trust her training, her experience, and her absolute certainty that the solution was correct. She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a small notebook. The pages were worn from being consulted many times, the margins filled with neat annotations. Inside were transformation rules she'd developed decades ago for intelligence databases, principles that worked just as well for historical archives. Winters, where the hell are you? Director Crawford's voice was getting closer, tinged with the kind of irritation that usually preceded formal reprimands. Margaret closed the notebook and returned it to her pocket. She'd made her decision. The only question now was whether she had the courage to follow through. Outside the alcove, the rain continued to fall, revealing brief glimpses of a darkening afternoon sky. Somewhere in that library was a historical legacy that only she could properly preserve, a continuity that only she could maintain. It was time to stop waiting for permission. Margaret's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she launched the final command script. The transformation sequence was second nature to her, logical steps developed over decades of information management, but this time felt different. This time she wasn't following protocol or completing an assigned task. She was acting on her own authority, guided by her own ethics. The system's processors hummed to life, their operation barely audible in the quiet library. She kept the display minimal, just basic progress indicators without flashy graphics that might attract attention. The last thing she needed was some curious staff member wandering over to investigate. Through the glass panels, she could hear fragments of conversation from Director Crawford's office. The mood was tense, defensive. The digital archives project had stalled, and focus was shifting to damage control and expectation management. Someone was already drafting emails about technical limitations and scaled-back demonstrations. Director Crawford, "This is the Historical Society," came a voice from the speakerphone in Crawford's office. "We're still waiting on confirmation that the primary collections will be properly integrated for the symposium demonstration. We're exploring alternative approaches," came Crawford's carefully measured response. "The technical challenges are more significant than initially anticipated." Alternative approaches. Administrative speak for "we're giving up on doing it right." Margaret's jaw tightened as she monitored the transformation progress. 15% complete. The scripts were working perfectly, preserving every relationship, every context, every carefully crafted connection between pieces of historical information. Through the windows, she could see the rain intensifying, drops streaming down the glass like tears. Inside the library, the remaining staff members were huddled near the circulation desk, their expressions a mixture of frustration and resignation. Her fingers moved across the keyboard, making minor adjustments to optimize the processing. Not rushing the transformation, but guiding it, nurturing it like a gardener tending to a delicate plant. This wasn't just about technical success. It was about respect for the information itself. "Winters." The voice echoed through the quiet library, sharp with impatience. Director Crawford was looking for her again, probably wondering why the quarterly metrics hadn't appeared on her desk yet. Margaret minimized the progress window, now showing 27% complete, and opened a simple catalog search. The transformation would continue in the background, invisible to casual observation, but steadily working its magic on the historical collections. A movement caught her eye. Derek Chun was approaching the main desk, his expression carefully neutral. The distraction they'd planned was about to happen. "The display of new acquisitions is about to have an accident," Derek said quietly as he passed the research alcove. "Are you sure about this?" Margaret looked at her friend, then at the rain-streaked windows, then at the progress indicator. Now showing 32% complete. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." "If you're caught, I won't be," Margaret interrupted. "The transformation is sound, Derek. I know it sounds impossible, but I've designed these protocols before. I can preserve connections that would otherwise be lost because I understand how information relates to other information." Derek nodded slowly. Crawford's latest email mentioned flattening all the hierarchical relationships to simplify the migration. That would destroy 2 centuries of careful cataloging. Then I'd better keep going. Margaret returned to the workstation and checked the progress. 41% complete. Everything was proceeding perfectly. System resources, processing tasks, memory allocation. The old machine was performing beautifully under her guidance. "Margaret," Derek's voice was soft but urgent. "When this is done, and it will work, they're going to ask how you did it. How you solved a problem that defeated everyone else." Margaret smiled grimly. "I'll tell them the truth. That sometimes too complicated is just another word for worth doing right." She adjusted a parameter in the transformation script and watched as the system responded immediately. The progress jumped to 43%. Derek moved away toward the display of new acquisitions, preparing for the distraction they'd planned. The phone rang at the circulation desk. Brad Thompson answered it, his expression shifting from boredom to concern. "Director Crawford, it's the county commissioner's office. They want an update on the symposium demonstration preparations." The response from Crawford's office was delayed, hesitant. "Tell them we're implementing alternative approaches to the metadata integration. The technical challenges are being addressed." Margaret's hands tightened on the keyboard. Alternative approaches. Not impossible, not canceled, just alternative. As if the preservation of historical relationships was some optional feature that could be discarded for convenience. Through the glass panels, she could see Director Crawford emerging from her office, expression dark with frustration. She was probably wondering where her quarterly metrics report was, why the oldest member of her staff wasn't at her assigned. Post-sorting overdue notices. In a few minutes she'd start looking in earnest, but by then the transformation would be well past the point of no return. Margaret took a deep breath and checked the progress indicator. 52% complete. More than halfway there. The system was performing flawlessly under her guidance, preserving connections that would otherwise be lost forever. From across the library came a sudden crash. Derek had accidentally knocked over the display of new acquisitions, sending books cascading across the floor in a carefully orchestrated distraction. "Oh no, I'm so sorry." His voice carried through the quiet space, drawing everyone's attention. Staff members rushed to help, including Director Crawford, momentarily, forgetting about the missing Margaret Winters. The distraction worked perfectly. While all eyes were on the fallen display, the progress meter climbed steadily. 61%, 65%, 68%. Margaret made a final adjustment to the processing parameters, optimizing the system resources for the home. Stretch, this wasn't just about technical success anymore. It was about respect for information itself, for the careful work of generations of librarians and historians who had built these relationships one connection at a time. The progress meter hit 75%, just as the commotion from the fallen display began to subside. Staff members were returning to their posts, books restored to their proper places. Soon, attention would return to the missing quarterly metrics and the absent elderly librarian. Margaret's fingers flew across the keyboard, not with panic but with the precise efficiency of someone who had spent decades working with the most sophisticated information systems in the world. The transformation was in its final stages, rebuilding indexes and verifying relationships across the entire collection. 85% complete. Through the windows, the rain had begun to ease, revealing glimpses of clearing sky. Inside the library, order was being restored after Derek's accident. Director Crawford was returning to her office, probably expecting to find the quarterly metrics on her desk. 90% complete. Margaret could hear footsteps approaching the research alcove. Time was running out. But the transformation was nearly complete. The historical relationships preserved in their full complexity. What had seemed impossible to the younger staff was nearly accomplished. 95% complete. Winters? Are you in there? Director Crawford's voice, just outside the research alcove. Margaret took a deep breath and watched the final percentage points tick upward. 98%, 99%, 100%. Transformation complete. She quickly closed the command window and opened the new digital archives interface, just as Director Crawford appeared at the entrance to the alcove. "There you are. I've been looking everywhere for you." The quarterly metrics were due an hour ago. Margaret turned to face her, expression calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I'm sorry, Director. I was just testing something with the historical collections. I think you might want to see this." Crawford's expression shifted from irritation to confusion as Margaret gestured to the screen. There, displayed in perfect clarity, was the new digital archives interface, fully populated with the complete historical collections. Every relationship preserved, every context maintained. "What is this? How did you?" Crawford stepped closer, disbelief evident in her voice. "I found a way to preserve the hierarchical relationships while still completing the migration," Margaret said simply. "All the historical connections are intact." Crawford stared at the screen, then at Margaret, then back at the screen. The demonstration that had been deemed technically impossible was running perfectly before her eyes. This is exactly what we need for the symposium," she said slowly. "How did you solve the metadata transformation issues?" The technical team said it couldn't be done without flattening the relationships. Margaret smiled slightly. "Sometimes too complicated is just another word for worth doing right." As Director Crawford explored the transformed system with growing amazement, Margaret felt a quiet sense of vindication settling over her. The historical connections had been preserved. The work of generations of librarians would continue to guide researchers in the digital age. All because one 71-year-old librarian had refused to accept that something valuable was too complicated to save. Derek appeared in the doorway, giving her a subtle thumbs-up behind Crawford's back. Mission accomplished. Director Crawford's sudden enthusiasm was almost comical. Just 30 minutes earlier, she had been resigned to a watered-down demonstration for the symposium. Now she was calling in staff members to witness what she described as a breakthrough in digital archiving methodology. "Everyone, gather around," she announced, waving toward the research alcove where Margaret still sat quietly at the workstation. "Ms. Winters has developed a solution to our metadata integration problems." The same colleagues who had dismissed Margaret all morning now crowded around the terminal, their expressions shifting from skepticism to astonishment as they witnessed the fully functioning digital archive. "How did you preserve the hierarchical relationships?" asked Amber, leaning closer to the screen. "We tried every standard protocol in the migration toolkit." "Standard protocols don't always work for non-standard collections," Margaret replied, her voice soft but confident. "Our historical archives weren't built according to modern cataloging principles. They evolved organically over 2 centuries. They needed a custom approach." Brad Thompson peered over Amber's shoulder, his earlier mockery replaced by grudging respect. "But where did you learn to write transformation scripts like this? These aren't in any of the training materials." Margaret simply smiled, let them wonder. Derek caught her eye from the back of the group and gave her a subtle nod of approval. He alone knew that her expertise came from somewhere far removed from library science workshops. "The important thing," Director Crawford interjected, already shifting into presentation mode, "is that we now have a fully functional demonstration for the symposium. Ms. Winters, I'd like you to document your methodology for the technical team. And perhaps you could assist with the presentation preparation." The request, framed as a generous opportunity rather than the acknowledgement of expertise it should have been, made Margaret's jaw tighten. But she nodded politely. "Of course, Director. Happy to help." As the crowd dispersed, buzzing with renewed excitement about the symposium, Derek lingered behind. "That was masterful," he said quietly. "Both the technical solution and how you handled Crawford taking credit." "I'm not interested in credit," Margaret replied, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "I just couldn't stand by and watch them destroy 2 centuries of careful work. Still, you should be leading this project, not just assisting." Derek's indignation on her behalf was touching. Margaret was about to respond when her phone chimed with an incoming text message. She glanced at the screen and froze. "Protocol Amber. Verification required." The message was from a number she hadn't seen in nearly 20 years, but instantly recognized. Protocol Amber was an emergency contact procedure from her intelligence days, a relic from a past life that was supposed to remain buried. "Margaret? Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." She forced a smile. "Just an old friend with bad timing. Nothing important." But as she slipped the phone back into her pocket, her hand trembled slightly. Protocol Amber was never used for social calls. Something was happening, something that had caused her former agency to reach out to a long-retired operative. "I should get started on that documentation for Director Crawford," she said, rising from the workstation. "Would you mind keeping an eye on the system for a few minutes? I need to make a quick call." Derek nodded, concern evident in his expression, but he didn't press for details. That was one of the things she appreciated about him. He respected boundaries. Margaret made her way to the staff break room, now empty as everyone focused on the revitalized symposium preparations. She closed the door and pulled out her phone, dialing a number she had memorized decades ago and never forgotten. The line connected after a single ring. "Verification," came a clipped voice. "November Echo Sierra 4729 Sierra," Margaret responded. the code flowing from her memory as if she had used it yesterday instead of 20 years ago. Identity confirmed. Stand by for connection. There was a brief silence, then a new voice, older gravelly, but immediately familiar. Maggie, it's been a long time, Robert. She sank into a chair, feeling the weight of the past settle. Around her shoulders, protocol amber is for emergencies only. What's happened? Robert Jenkins had been her handler during her final years with the agency. The fact that he was the one making contact meant this was serious. We have a situation. That requires your unique expertise. His voice was measured, professional, but she could hear the tension underneath. There's been a breach at the Oak Ridge Repository. Margaret's breath caught. The Oak Ridge Repository wasn't a physical location, it was a coded reference to a specific type of classified intelligence, historical operations data that had never been digitized due to its sensitivity. That's impossible, she said automatically. Those records were secured under multiple protocols that I designed myself. That's why we need you, Maggie. Someone's using your methods against us. The implications were staggering. The historical operations data contained details of covert actions going back to the early Cold War. Information that could compromise still active assets and reopen diplomatic wounds that had taken decades to heal. I've been retired for nearly 20 years, Robert. Surely there are active analysts better equipped. Nobody understands the Oak Ridge protocols like you do. He interrupted. You didn't just implement them, you created them. We need your pattern recognition skills. Margaret closed her eyes, memories flooding back, the tension of those final years, the weight of knowing too much, the relief when she had finally walked away to build a quieter life among books instead of secrets. What exactly are you asking? We need you to come in. Just for a consultation, a day maybe two. Come in where? I'm in Somerset County, not Washington. We have a secure facility in Pittsburgh, 2 hours from you. I can have a car there. This evening. Margaret glanced at her watch. The symposium was 3 weeks away. The digital archive system was now functioning, but there was still documentation to complete, presentations to prepare. I can't just disappear, Robert. I have responsibilities here. Maggie, his voice dropped lower, more urgent. The breach appears targeted. Whoever is doing this knows exactly what they're looking for. We've detected queries focusing on Operation Blackbriar. The name hit her like a physical blow. Blackbriar had been her final operation, a complex counterintelligence action that had ended her field career and led to her transition to information systems. If those details became public, I need a cover story, she said finally. And I can only give you tomorrow. I'll drive myself to Pittsburgh. That's not protocol. I'm not an active operative anymore, Robert. Either I drive myself, or I don't come at all. A pause, then a sigh of resignation. Fine, I'll text you the address. Confirmation code, Delta Echo Sierra 7. I remember the confirmation protocols, she said dryly. Of course you do. That's why we need you. The call ended, leaving Margaret sitting alone in the break room, her reflection staring back at her from the darkened window. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, leaving the world washed clean but somehow more ominous. 20 years of careful separation between her past and present were about to collapse. The quiet life she had built for herself, the library, the books, the simple pleasures of helping researchers discover historical connections, all of it suddenly felt fragile, like a carefully constructed facade that could crumble at any moment. The door to the break room opened, and Derek peered in. Margaret, Director Crawford is looking for you. Something about documentation for the symposium presentation. She nodded, composing herself with the skill of someone who had spent decades concealing her true thoughts. Tell her I'll be right there. I just needed a moment of quiet. Derek hesitated, clearly sensing something was wrong. Are you sure you're okay? You seem different. Margaret smiled, the expression not quite reaching her eyes. Just tired. It's been an eventful day. As Derek retreated, Margaret gathered herself, mentally shifting gears from retired intelligence analyst back to unassuming elderly librarian. It was a transition she had performed countless times over the years, but never with such a sense of urgency. Tomorrow she would have to confront a past she had deliberately left behind. But today, she still had a role to play and documentation to write for a library director who had no idea who really sat behind that grandmotherly smile. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the rain replaced by a crystalline autumn sky that seemed to mock Margaret's inner turmoil. She dressed with careful deliberation, choosing a conservative gray pantsuit that she rarely wore to the library, where cardigans and comfortable slacks were her usual attire. Today's Margaret Winters needed to look different, more authoritative. She had called Director Crawford the previous evening with a hastily constructed story about a family emergency requiring her to take a personal day. Crawford had been surprisingly accommodating. The successful resolution of the digital archives crisis had apparently elevated Margaret's standing considerably. The drive to Pittsburgh took exactly 2 hours and 17 minutes. Margaret navigated the increasingly dense traffic with the same precision she brought to everything else, her mind racing not with anxiety, but with methodical preparation. If someone was breaching the Oak Ridge repository using techniques similar to her own, she needed to remember every detail of the protocols she had established 2 decades earlier. The secure facility turned out to be a nondescript office building in a commercial park north of the city. No external signage indicated its true purpose, just a suite number and a keypad entry system. Margaret parked in the visitor section, noting the discreet security cameras tracking her approach. She entered the code Robert had texted her, Delta Echo Sierra 7, and heard the soft click of the door unlocking. Inside, the reception area looked like any corporate office. Bland furniture, muted colors, generic artwork on the walls. The only unusual feature was the absence of a company name or logo anywhere visible. A young woman seated at the reception desk looked up as Margaret entered. "May I help you?" "I have an appointment with Robert Jenkins." The woman's expression didn't change, but her posture straightened almost imperceptibly. "Your name, please?" "Margaret Winters." The receptionist's fingers moved across her keyboard. "Thank you. May I see some identification?" Margaret produced her driver's license, which the young woman scanned before returning it. "Mr. Jenkins will be with you shortly. Please have a seat." Margaret chose a chair with a clear view of both. The entrance and the interior door, an old habit she had never quite abandoned. She noticed the receptionist watching her with a new intensity. Likely she had just seen Margaret's security clearance level appear on her screen. 5 minutes later, the interior door opened, and Robert Jenkins emerged. 20 years had turned. His once dark hair completely silver and added lines to his face, but his posture remained military straight, his gaze sharp and assessing. "Margaret," he said warmly, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." She rose to meet him, clasping his hand firmly. "Robert, you're looking well." "Retirement agrees with me," he said with a small smile that acknowledged the irony. Neither of them was truly retired, not in the ways that mattered. He led her through the interior door into a corridor that immediately belied the mundane appearance of the reception area. Security checkpoints, reinforced doors, and surveillance systems that would have been at home in any high-level government facility lined the hallway. "The situation has escalated since we spoke," Robert said, quietly as they walked. "There was another probe last night, more sophisticated than the previous attempts. Do you have the technical details?" "All ready for your review. We've assembled a small team, just 3 analysts who have the necessary clearance. They've been briefed that you're a consultant with specialized knowledge of the legacy systems." Margaret nodded. Her cover within a cover, not quite a lie, but not the whole truth either. And what have you told them about my background? Former information systems specialist who helped design the original security protocols. Nothing. About your field operations or connection to Blackbriar. They reached a secured door at the end of the corridor. Robert placed his palm on a scanner, and the door slid open to reveal a windowless room dominated by a large conference table and multiple display screens. 3 people looked up as they entered, 2 men and a woman, all in their 30s or 40s, with the alert, slightly harried look of intelligence analysts working a high-priority case. "Team, this is Margaret Winters, the consultant I mentioned," Robert announced. "Ms. Winters, meet Alex Chun, our lead cybersecurity analyst. Drs. Sarah Kaplan and James Morrison, cryptographic specialists." Margaret nodded a greeting, automatically assessing each of them with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades evaluating potential assets and threats. Chun was the youngest, probably no more than 35, with the intensity of someone who lived and breathed code. Kaplan had the deliberate movements of a person accustomed to thinking before acting. Morrison's gaze was evaluative, slightly suspicious, smart then, and not easily convinced. Ms. Winters designed many of the security protocols that protect the legacy data systems currently under attack. Robert continued, "Should be helping us identify the breach methodology." "With all due respect," Morrison began, his tone suggesting. Minimal respect was actually being offered. These intrusion attempts are using cutting-edge techniques that weren't even theoretical 20 years ago. How exactly is historical knowledge going to help us? Margaret met his gaze evenly. Because, Dr. Morrison, the underlying architecture of the Oak Ridge systems was specifically designed to be resistant to technological evolution. The protective measures weren't based on the specific encryption standards of the time, but on pattern recognition principles that remain effective regardless of processing power advances. Morrison blinked, clearly not expecting such a technical response from the elderly woman he had mentally dismissed. Robert suppressed a smile. "Why don't we show Ms. Winters what we're dealing with?" Chun nodded and tapped a command on his keyboard. The main display screen filled with lines of code and access logs. The intrusion attempts began 3 days ago. Initially, they appeared to be standard probing actions, testing for vulnerabilities in the perimeter security. But last night, the approach changed. The attacker began using what appears to be insider knowledge of the system architecture. Margaret studied the data, feeling a chill of recognition. The pattern was immediately familiar, a systematic exploration using variable pathways, exactly the technique she had developed for penetrating secured information systems during her active service. They're using a modified Fibonacci sequence to determine the probe intervals, she said quietly. That's not a standard approach. The room fell silent. Chun stared at her, then back at the screen. "I hadn't detected that pattern." "It's subtle," Margaret acknowledged. "The sequence is slightly altered from the mathematical standard, using a custom seed value that changes the progression." She moved closer to the screen, her eyes tracking across the data with practiced efficiency. "May I?" Chun nodded and slid his keyboard toward her. Margaret's fingers moved across the keys with surprising speed, pulling up additional logs and comparing timestamps. "The seed value is 47, she said after a moment. "That's specific." Robert moved to stand beside her. "Significant?" "It was the designation for a particular type of operational security protocol we developed for the Blackbriar network." She looked up at him, her expression grave. "This isn't random, Robert. Whoever is doing this knows exactly how I structured the security systems." The implication hung in the air, unspoken but clear. The attacker was either someone from their own intelligence community who had access to Margaret's methodologies, or worse, someone she had personally trained. "Can you block the intrusion?" Kaplan asked, breaking the tense silence. Margaret turned to face the team. "I can do better than that. I can create a false access path that will look legitimate to anyone using my methods. We can track them, see exactly what they're looking for, and potentially identify them. How long would that take to implement? Robert asked. A few hours. The underlying architecture is still familiar to me, even after all this time. She allowed herself a small smile. Some patterns you never forget. Morrison still looked skeptical. And we're supposed to just trust that a consultant who hasn't worked with these systems in decades can outthink a sophisticated modern attacker. Margaret met his gaze evenly. Dr. Morrison, I understand your skepticism. But these security protocols weren't just systems I worked with, they were systems I created. The Oak Ridge Repository's basic architecture was my design, implemented according to principles that I developed specifically to resist exactly the kind of attack we're seeing now. James, Robert interjected, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who rarely needed to raise it. Ms. Winters has my complete confidence. Her expertise in this particular area is unmatched. Morrison subsided, though his expression remained doubtful. I'll need direct access to the system core, Margaret said, turning back to Robert. And a secure workstation isolated from the main network. Chun looked alarmed. That would violate at least 3 current security protocols. Which is exactly why the system remains vulnerable, Margaret replied calmly. Your modern security measures are creating predictable patterns that someone using my methods can exploit. I need to work outside those patterns. Robert studied her for a moment, then nodded. Make it happen, Chen. Full access, isolated workstation, no monitoring. Sir, I must formally object. Objection noted. Robert cut him off. Do it anyway. As Chun reluctantly began making the arrangements, Robert drew Margaret aside. Are you sure about this, Maggie? If you're right about the intrusion method, we're dealing with someone who knows your work intimately. She nodded, her expression grim. That's precisely why I'm the only one who can stop them. They're using my own techniques against you, but they're forgetting one crucial thing. What's that? Margaret's eyes hardened with a determination that transformed her face, briefly revealing the formidable intelligence operative beneath the librarian's facade. I never taught anyone everything I knew. The isolated workstation was set up in a small windowless room that reminded Margaret of the secure facilities where she had spent countless hours during her intelligence career. The familiarity was both comforting and unsettling, like slipping into an old skin she had deliberately shed decades ago. System is completely air-gapped, Chun explained as he completed the setup. No external connections, no monitoring. Software, nothing that could compromise your work. Margaret nodded, settling into the chair. Thank you, Mr. Chun. I appreciate your thoroughness, despite your reservations. The young analyst hesitated, his professional caution warring with curiosity. Ms. Winters, may I ask you something? You can ask, she replied with a small smile. I might not answer. How did you recognize that pattern so quickly? I've been staring at those logs for days. Margaret considered him for a moment. Unlike Morrison, Chun's question seemed motivated by genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. When you've spent enough time immersed in certain patterns, Mr. Chun, they become like a familiar voice in a crowded room. You don't need to analyze every sound to recognize it. You simply know. Chun nodded slowly, like musical perfect pitch. Something like that, yes. She turned to the workstation. I should get started. The attacker will likely make another attempt tonight, following the pattern progression. I'll be in the main analysis room if you need anything, Chun said, moving toward the door. He paused, then added, for what it's worth, I think Mr. Jenkins is right about you. When the door closed behind him, Margaret took a deep breath and focused on the system before her. The interface had been updated since her time, but the underlying architecture, her architecture, remained recognizable beneath the modern security layers. She began typing, her fingers finding their rhythm as she navigated through the security protocols. It was like speaking a language she hadn't used in years, slightly rusty at first, but quickly becoming fluent again as muscle. Memory took over. The Oak Ridge repository had been her final major project before retirement, a comprehensive system for preserving highly sensitive operational data in a form that could never be fully digitized or networked. The security wasn't based solely on technological barriers, but on intricate patterns of access pathways that changed according to principles only a handful of people fully understood. Now someone was using those same principles to try to breach the system. Someone who understood her methods well enough to recreate them with modern technology. The list of potential suspects was disturbingly short. Margaret worked steadily for hours, creating a false access corridor that would appear legitimate to anyone using her methodologies. The trap was elegant in its simplicity, not blocking the intruder, but misdirecting them through a controlled environment where every action could be monitored and traced. She was making final adjustments when the door opened and Robert entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said, placing 1 cup beside her. "How's it coming?" "Almost ready," Margaret replied, gratefully accepting. "The coffee. The false pathway is established. When they make their next attempt, they'll think they've found a vulnerability, but they'll actually be entering a controlled environment we can monitor." Robert settled into a chair beside her. "The team is impressed. Even Morrison has stopped questioning your expertise." "I'm not here to impress them, Robert. I'm here to stop whoever is trying to access Blackbriar data." He studied her for a moment. "Does it feel strange? Coming back to this world after so long?" Margaret's hands stilled on the keyboard. "It's like visiting a country where you used to live. Everything is simultaneously familiar and foreign." She took a sip of coffee. "What I find more concerning is how easily I've slipped back into these patterns of thinking." "You never really leave this life behind, Maggie." "Not completely." She met his gaze. "I did leave it behind. I built something different, something meaningful. The library, the community I serve. It matters to me. I know." His voice softened. "And you'll go back to it. But right now, we need the Margaret Winters who designed the Oak Ridge protocols." She nodded, returning her attention to the screen. "The trap is set. Now we wait." As if on cue, an alert flashed on the monitor. Margaret leaned forward, suddenly intent. "That's not possible," she murmured. "They're early." The pattern indicated the next attempt would be after midnight. "They've changed their approach. No, they're accelerating." Her fingers flew across the keyboard, making rapid adjustments. "They know we're onto them. Someone must have detected our preparations." Robert's expression darkened. "A leak within the facility? Or they have resources we haven't accounted for." The alert changed from yellow to red. "They're in. Following the false pathway, exactly as I predicted." The screen filled with scrolling data as the intruder moved through the controlled environment Margaret had created. She watched intently, reading the patterns of movement like a tracker following footprints. "They're looking for something specific," she said after several minutes. "Not just general Blackbriar data. They're focusing on the Budapest operation." Robert stiffened. "Budapest was your extraction mission, the one that ended your field career." "Yes." Margaret's voice was tight. "Which narrows the list of potential suspects considerably." The data flow suddenly changed, becoming more erratic. "They've realized something's wrong. They're trying to back out. Can you trace them?" "I'm trying, but they're using sophisticated masking techniques." Her hands moved across the keyboard with increasing urgency. "Wait, there's something." A string of code appeared briefly before vanishing. Margaret froze, her face draining of color. "What is it?" Robert asked, alarmed by her reaction. "That's my personal verification code," she said quietly. "A signature I embedded in all my systems. No one else should know it. What are you saying, Maggie? She turned to face him, her expression grave. I'm saying the attacker isn't just using my methods, Robert. They're using my personal identifiers. There are only 3 possibilities. Someone with access to my classified personnel file, someone I personally trained, or someone wants us to think it's me. The implications hung in the air between them. Before Robert could respond, the door burst open and Chun rushed in. We've got a location, he announced breathlessly. The intrusion is coming from a server farm in Arlington, Virginia. Robert and Margaret exchanged glances. Arlington, home to numerous intelligence agencies and contractors. Can you narrow it down further? Robert asked. Chun shook his head. The signal is bouncing through multiple relays. This is as close as we can get without a physical investigation. Margaret turned back to her monitor, studying the data with renewed intensity. There's something else here, she murmured. A secondary pattern embedded in the primary approach. Her fingers moved across the keyboard, isolating and expanding. The anomaly, it's a message, encoded in the intrusion pattern itself. Can you decrypt it? Robert asked. I already have, Margaret replied, her voice strange. It's for me, specifically. She pointed to the screen where a decoded message now appeared. Maggie Blattbriar wasn't. What you think? Meet where IT ended. D, Robert stared at. The message then at Margaret. D, as in David Mercer? She nodded slowly. My partner in Budapest. The man who supposedly died there. That's impossible, Robert said flatly. Mercer was confirmed Kia. I saw the reports myself. I saw the reports too. Margaret's voice was steady, but her hands had tightened into fists. I also saw the building explode with him inside it. But this message uses personal references. Only David would know. It could be a trap, Robert warned. Someone using Mercer's identity to draw you out. Of course it could. She met his gaze evenly. But what if it isn't? What if David survived somehow? What if everything we believed about Budapest was wrong? The question hung between them, charged with 2 decades of unexamined history. Chun cleared his throat awkwardly. Should I inform the rest of the team about this development? Robert hesitated, then shook his head. Not yet. Ms. Winters and I need to discuss the implications privately. When Chun had left, closing the door behind him, Robert turned back to Margaret. You can't seriously be considering meeting this person. Where it ended, she murmured, almost to herself. He means the Burnham Memorial. The cemetery? Maggie, this is madness. If Mercer somehow survived Budapest, why wait 20 years? To contact you? I don't know, she admitted. But I need to find out. I can't authorize a field operation based on this, Robert said firmly. Especially not one involving a retired operative with no recent training. Margaret's expression hardened with sudden resolve. I'm not asking for authorization, Robert. I'm going to meet him, with or without your approval. Maggie, I spent 20 years believing I left David to die in that building. She interrupted, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. 20 years carrying that weight. If there's even a chance he's alive, I need to know why he's reaching out now. Robert studied her for a long moment. You always were the most stubborn analyst I ever worked with, he said finally. Fine, but you're not going alone. I'm coming with you. No, she said firmly. The message was clear, just me. If David sees anyone else, he'll disappear, and we'll never know what this is about. It's too dangerous. I can take care of myself, Robert. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. I may be a 71-year-old librarian now, but I haven't forgotten everything. He recognized the steel in her voice, the same determination that had made her one of his most effective operatives decades earlier. At least take a communication device, he insisted. And I want a team on standby nearby, not visible, but close enough to intervene if needed. Agreed, she conceded. But they stay completely out of sight. This might be our only chance to learn what's really happening. Robert nodded reluctantly. When does he want to meet? Margaret looked back at the encoded message, analyzing the pattern once more. The time signature is embedded in the intrusion sequence, midnight tonight. That gives us less than 6 hours to prepare. I don't need 6 hours, Margaret said, rising from her chair with newfound energy. What I need is to understand why someone would breach highly secure systems just to deliver a message they could have sent in numerous other ways. Maybe the message isn't the point, Robert suggested. Maybe the breach itself was the objective and the message is misdirection. Margaret considered this. Possible, but the intrusion pattern was too specific, too personal. Whoever did this wanted me involved, wanted me specifically to see their methods. Which brings us back to the question of who knew enough about your methodologies to replicate them. A question I intend to have answered tonight. Margaret's expression was resolute. I need a secure vehicle and a standard field kit. Robert raised an eyebrow. Planning to go armed to this reunion. Planning to be prepared, she corrected. If it really is David waiting for me, he'll expect nothing less. 4 hours later, Margaret sat in an unmarked sedan 2 blocks from the Burnham Memorial Cemetery, waiting for the digital watch on her wrist to reach 23:30. Robert had provided everything she requested: the car, a basic field kit with communication devices, and a standard issue sidearm that now rested in a holster beneath her jacket. The weight of the weapon was both foreign and familiar, like meeting an old acquaintance who had aged in unexpected ways. She had maintained her marksmanship over the years, visiting a shooting range monthly under the pretense of senior self-defense classes. Some habits were too ingrained to abandon completely. Her mind replayed the Budapest operation for the 100th time that day. It had been meant to be a simple extraction, retrieve a defecting scientist from a research facility before his absence was discovered. But something had gone catastrophically wrong. The alarms had triggered early, security forces had converged on their location, and the extraction plan had disintegrated into chaos. David had stayed behind to secure their escape route, planting explosive charges to cover their retreat. Margaret had gotten the scientist to the extraction point, but when she tried to return for David, the building had erupted in flames. All communication had been lost. The official report listed him as killed in action, body unrecoverable. She had left the field after that, transitioning to information systems where she could use her analytical mind without risking another partner. Eventually, she had retired completely, choosing the quiet anonymity of library work over the constant tension of intelligence operations. And now, 20 years later, someone claiming to be David Mercer wanted to meet at the cemetery where an empty casket bearing his name had been buried with full honors. The watch beeped softly to 23:30. Time to move. Margaret started the car and drove the final blocks to the cemetery. The iron gate stood open despite the late hour. Someone had made arrangements. She parked near the entrance, ensuring the vehicle was positioned for a quick departure if necessary. I'm on site, she murmured into the small communications. Device concealed in her jacket collar. Proceeding to the meeting point. Acknowledged, came Robert's voice in her earpiece. Backup team is in position, 200 meters south of the memorial. Remind them to maintain absolute distance unless I signal. They know the protocol, Maggie. Be careful. The cemetery was eerily silent as she made her way along the winding path toward the central memorial, a large stone monument dedicated to fallen intelligence operatives whose sacrifices could never be publicly acknowledged. David's name wasn't carved into the stone. The listed names were symbolic rather than comprehensive, but it was here that his memorial service had been held. As she approached the monument, Margaret scanned her surroundings with the practiced efficiency of someone who had never truly forgotten her training. The memorial plaza was empty, the surrounding trees casting long shadows in the moonlight. No obvious places for an ambush, but plenty of concealment for someone who knew what they were doing. She stopped beside the stone monument, positioning herself with clear sightlines in all directions. The night air was cool against her skin, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and distant rain. "Hello, Maggie." The voice came from behind her, soft, slightly raspy, but unmistakable despite the passage of years. Margaret turned slowly, her hand instinctively moving toward the concealed weapon. A figure emerged from the shadows of a nearby oak tree. An elderly man with white hair and a deeply lined face, walking with a slight limp. His appearance had changed dramatically, but his eyes, those sharp, assessing eyes, were exactly as she remembered. "David," she breathed, her hand freezing halfway to her weapon. He smiled sadly. "It's been a long time." 20 years, she replied, finding her voice. 20 years of believing you were dead. For most of those years, that was safer for both of us. He moved closer, stopping a few paces away. Close enough for conversation, far enough to respect her caution. "You look good, Maggie. Library work agrees with you." The casual reference to her current life confirmed what she already suspected. He had been monitoring her. For how long, she couldn't guess. "You went to a lot of trouble to arrange this meeting," she said, deliberately keeping her tone neutral. "Breaching the Oak Ridge repository is an extreme way to deliver a dinner invitation." "I needed to be certain you'd come alone," he replied. "And I needed to know if you still had access to the systems you designed." "Why?" David glanced around the empty cemetery. "Because Blackbriar wasn't what we thought it was, Maggie. It wasn't a rogue weapons program we were shutting down. It was something much worse." "Explain," she demanded, her patience wearing thin. "Not here." He reached into his pocket and produced a small data drive. "Everything I've discovered is on this. 20 years of investigating what really happened in Budapest, and why I was considered more valuable dead than alive." Margaret made no move to take the drive. "Why now, David? Why reach out after all this time?" His expression grew grave. "Because they're reactivating the program under a new name. And because someone has connected you to the original operation. Someone who doesn't believe you've spent the last 20 years just being a librarian." A chill ran through her that had nothing to do with the night air. "Who? That's what I need your help to find out." He held out the drive again. "I can't do this alone, Maggie. I never could. That's why I sent the message the way I did. To remind you of who you really are." She studied him for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception in his aged face. The David Mercer she had known had been honest to a fault. It was one of the qualities that had made them an effective team. His eyes still held that same direct intensity. "How do I know I can trust you?" she asked finally. "You let me believe. You were dead for 20 years. You don't know," he admitted. "But you came anyway, because some part of you has always known there was more to Budapest than what was in the official reports." He was right, and they both knew it. Margaret had accepted the official explanation, had built a new life around it, but somewhere deep in her analytical mind, inconsistencies had always nagged at her. She stepped forward and took the drive from his hand. "If I find that this is some kind of manipulation, David, you'll find me and make me regret it," he finished with a faint smile. "Some things never change. I'm not the same person I was 20 years ago," she warned. "None of us are," he replied quietly. "But some parts of us remain constant, no matter how much time passes. Your sense of justice, your need to uncover the truth. Those things don't disappear just because you've spent 2 decades helping people find books instead of information assets." A rustle in the trees to their left caught Margaret's attention. David noticed her subtle shift in focus and tensed. "You were followed," he said, already beginning to back away. "No," she said quickly. "It's a backup team. They won't approach unless I signal." He relaxed slightly but continued to create distance between them. "Read what's on the drive, Maggie. When you're ready to talk, use the contact protocol included." In the files, I'll find you. David, she began, but he was already retreating into the shadows. Be careful who you trust, he called softly. Even old friends might not be what they seem. Then he was gone, vanishing into the darkness with the same skill he had displayed decades earlier. Margaret stood alone beside the memorial, the data drive heavy in her hand. In her earpiece, Robert's voice was tense with concern. Maggie, report. We detected another presence but couldn't get visual confirmation. She hesitated, her mind racing through implications and possibilities. If David was right, if Blackbriar was being reactivated and someone had connected her to the original operation, then everyone was potentially suspect, even Robert. False alarm, she said finally. Just a security guard making rounds. Meeting complete. Heading back to the vehicle. As she walked back through the silent cemetery, Margaret felt the weight of her former life settling around her shoulders once more. The quiet retirement she had built so carefully was unraveling with each step. Tonight, she would return to Somerset County and her library. She would smile at her colleagues and help patrons find the information they sought. But beneath that carefully maintained facade, Margaret Winters, former intelligence operative, system designer, and now keeper of dangerous secrets, would be making plans of her own. David's warning echoed in her mind. Be careful who you trust. After 20 years of believing she knew exactly where she belonged, Margaret suddenly found herself back in a world where nothing was certain and no one was quite what they seemed, including, perhaps, herself. The Somerset County Library had never felt so foreign to Margaret as it did the morning after her cemetery meeting with David. The familiar scent of books and furniture polish, the gentle murmur of patrons, the soft clicking of keyboards. All of it seemed like an elaborate stage set, something meticulously constructed but fundamentally unreal. Margaret? Are you with us? Director Crawford's voice broke through her thoughts. She blinked, refocusing on the staff meeting taking place around her. Crawford and 5 other librarians were staring at her with varying degrees of concern. I'm sorry, Margaret said, summoning a tired smile. I didn't sleep well last night. What were you saying? I was asking if you'd completed the documentation for your digital archive solution. Crawford repeated, a hint of impatience in her tone. The symposium is in less than 3 weeks. Almost finished, Margaret assured her. I'll have it on your desk by tomorrow morning. The meeting continued, but Margaret's mind kept drifting to the data drive hidden in her apartment. She hadn't dared examine it yet, not without proper security precautions. If David was right about Blackbriar being reactivated, then the information he'd given her was explosive in more ways than one. When the meeting finally ended, Derek caught up with her in the reference section. You look like you've seen a ghost, he said quietly, his expression concerned. Did something happen during your day off? Margaret hesitated. Derek was the closest thing she had to a friend at the library, perhaps anywhere, but involving him in this situation would put him at risk. Family matters, she said vaguely. Nothing serious, just stirring up old memories. He studied her face for a moment. You know, in all the time we've worked together, you've never once mentioned your family. There's not much to tell, she replied with a shrug. My life before Somerset County was quite ordinary. The lie felt bitter on her tongue, but necessary. Better that Derek continued to see her as nothing more than an elderly librarian with a knack for information systems. If you say so. He clearly didn't believe her, but was too polite to press further. By the way, Director Crawford's been showing off your digital archive solution to everyone who'll listen. The county commissioner's office called this morning. They want to feature it in their next newsletter. Margaret managed a smile. That's nice. Nice, it's a huge deal. You single-handedly saved the symposium, and Crawford's acting like she personally invented digital archiving. I'm not interested in recognition, Derek. I just didn't want to see important historical connections lost. He shook his head in amazement. Sometimes I don't understand you at all, Margaret. anyone else would be demanding credit. At my age, you learn what battles are worth fighting. She patted his arm gently. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some research to do. Margaret made her way to the most isolated terminal in the reference section, one partially concealed by tall bookshelves that offered at least some privacy. She couldn't access David's data drive here, but she could begin preliminary research on what he'd told her. With practiced efficiency, she navigated to several academic databases and began searching for information on classified weapons programs from the early 2000s, the period when Blackbriar had been operational. She was careful to frame her searches in scholarly terms, making them appear to be nothing more unusual than historical research. Most of the results were predictably vague, redacted reports, theoretical analyses, journalistic speculations. But scattered among them were occasional fragments of concrete information: funding appropriations, facility locations, personnel reassignments. Margaret had spent decades developing the ability to construct meaningful patterns from seemingly unrelated data points. It was a skill that had made her exceptional, both as an intelligence analyst and as a librarian. Now she applied that skill to the fragments before her, mentally assembling a timeline of events surrounding the Budapest operation. What emerged was disturbing. In the months leading up to the mission that supposedly claimed David's life, several prominent scientists had disappeared from their positions at European research institutions. The official explanations varied: resignations, sabbaticals, personal leaves, but the pattern was clear to Margaret's trained eye. These weren't random events. They were systematic removals. More troubling still, several of those same scientists appeared to have resurfaced years later in research positions with U.S. government contractors. Their names were slightly altered, their backgrounds obscured, but Margaret recognized the distinctive publication patterns and research methodologies. Finding everything you need? Margaret nearly jumped at Crawford's voice directly behind her. She quickly minimized her search window and turned to face the director. "Just some background research for a patron," she said smoothly. "Genealogical inquiry." Crawford nodded, though her eyes lingered curiously on the minimized windows. "I need that documentation by tomorrow, Margaret. The technical team can't proceed without it." "It will be ready," Margaret assured her. "I was just taking a short break." When Crawford finally moved away, Margaret decided she'd pushed her luck far enough for one day. The library was too exposed, too full of curious eyes and potential surveillance. Real research would have to wait until she was in the privacy of her apartment. She spent the remainder of her shift performing her regular duties with meticulous attention, helping patrons locate materials, organizing the reference collection, mentoring a new volunteer. To anyone watching, she was simply Margaret Winters, dedicated elderly librarian, just as she had been for 15 years. But beneath that careful facade, her mind was racing through contingency plans and security protocols she hadn't used in decades. That evening, in her modest apartment 3 blocks from the library, Margaret finally allowed herself to examine David's data drive. She didn't connect it to her regular laptop. Instead, she used an old computer she kept for precisely this kind of situation, one with no wireless capabilities and no connection to any network. The drive contained hundreds of files, documents, photographs, audio recordings, all meticulously organized in a structure that only someone trained in her specific methodology would understand. David had arranged the information, not chronologically or alphabetically, but according to relational significance, the same system she had developed for the Oak Ridge repository. The message was clear. This information was specifically for her, organized in a way that would allow her analytical mind to quickly identify the most critical connections. She began with the files marked with the highest relational value, those that formed the core of whatever David had discovered. The first was a heavily redacted mission report from Budapest, but with sections highlighted that had been withheld from the version she'd seen 20 years earlier. Margaret read with growing horror as the true nature of the operation became clear. The scientist they had extracted wasn't defecting from a weapons program. He was being forcibly recruited into one. The rescue had actually been an abduction, sanctioned at the highest levels of government, but concealed from the operatives carrying it out. David hadn't died in that explosion. He'd discovered the truth moments before the building was destroyed and had gone dark, using the chaos to disappear rather than return to an agency that had deliberately deceived them. For the next several hours, Margaret methodically worked through the files, assembling a comprehensive picture of what David had uncovered during his 20 years in hiding. The Blackbriar program hadn't been shut down as she'd been told. It had been relocated, renamed, and expanded. Its true purpose was staggering in its ambition and terrifying in its implications: the development of targeted biological agents, designed to affect specific genetic profiles. Weapons that could theoretically eliminate ethnic groups while leaving others untouched. The scientists who had disappeared and later resurfaced with new identities had been central to this research. Their expertise, ranging from molecular biology to advanced genetic sequencing, had been harvested, sometimes willingly, sometimes through coercion. And now, according to David's most recent intelligence, the program was being reactivated. Under a new name, Project Helix. A soft knock at her apartment door startled Margaret from her research. She quickly closed the files and removed the data drive, concealing it in a hollowed-out book on her shelf, an old spy trick that now seemed less melodramatic than it had when she'd first prepared the hiding place years ago. Through the peephole, she saw Derek standing in the hallway, holding what appeared to be a paper bag from the local deli. Margaret hesitated. Derek's appearance at her apartment was unprecedented. In all their years working together, he had never once visited her home. The timing was suspicious, to say the least. But if she turned him away, it would only raise more questions. She opened the door, keeping her expression neutral despite the alarm bells ringing in her mind. "Derek, this is unexpected." He shifted awkwardly, holding up the paper bag. "I brought sandwiches. You seemed off today, and I thought maybe you could use a friend." The gesture was so ordinary, so fundamentally decent, that Margaret felt a pang of guilt for her suspicion. "That's very kind of you. Please, come in." She led him into her small living room, acutely aware of the data drive hidden just a few feet away and the computer still sitting on her desk with the screen mercifully blank. "Your place is exactly how I imagined it would be," Derek commented, glancing around at the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that dominated every wall. "A librarian's dream." "Books have always been good companions," Margaret replied, taking the bag from him and moving to the kitchen to arrange the sandwiches on plates. The mundane activity helped calm her racing thoughts. "What brought this on, Derek? Not that I'm complaining about free dinner." He settled onto her sofa, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Honestly, I was worried about you. You've seemed different since you took that personal day. And I've never seen you distracted during a staff meeting before." Margaret returned with the plates and a pot of tea she'd quickly prepared. "That's very observant of you. But really, I'm fine. Just some old issues resurfacing." "Old issues?" "Like the kind that might explain why a brilliant information specialist with your skills spent the last 15 years working in a small county library?" Derek asked quietly. Margaret froze, her teacup halfway to her lips. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I think you are," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Margaret, I've respected your privacy all these years, but I'm not blind. The way you analyze information, the security protocols you instinctively apply to everything you do, the fact that you maintain a completely air-gapped computer in 2025, he gestured toward her desk. "You're not just a librarian. You never were." For a long moment, Margaret said nothing, her mind racing through possibilities. Denial would be simplest, but Derek clearly wasn't going to accept platitudes. The question was whether his suspicions were merely his own, or whether someone else had put him up to this confrontation. "Why bring this up now?" she asked finally. "Because something changed yesterday," he replied. "You came back different. Watchful, like someone who knows they're being hunted." The description was so accurate that Margaret almost smiled. "And if you're right, what then?" Derek leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Then maybe you could use someone on your side. Someone who isn't part of whatever world you used to inhabit." "You don't know what you're offering," she said softly. "Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again." "I know exactly what I'm offering," he countered. "I'm offering to help someone who's always helped others. Someone who saved our library's historical collections not for recognition, but because she understood the value of preserving connections between pieces of information." Margaret studied him carefully, weighing decades of ingrained caution against the practical reality of her situation. She was 71 years old, facing what appeared to be a conspiracy stretching back 20 years and potentially reaching into the highest levels of government. Having an ally, even one without training, might make the difference between success and failure. "What makes you think you can help?" she asked, still probing. Derek smiled slightly. "Before I became a librarian, I spent 8 years as a cybersecurity specialist with the NSA. Not field operations," he added quickly, seeing her expression. "Just data analysis, but I know my way around secure systems." The revelation stunned Margaret into momentary silence. All these years, she had thought she was the only one hiding a past life behind a librarian's facade. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" she asked finally. "Same reason you didn't, I imagine," he replied with a shrug. "Some histories are better left undiscussed, until they're not." Margaret set down her teacup and made a decision. "What I'm about to tell you could put you in danger, Derek. Real danger, not the theoretical kind they warn about in security briefings." "I understand. I don't think you do," she said grimly. "But you will." Over the next hour, Margaret outlined the situation in carefully measured terms. Her former role in intelligence, the Budapest operation, David's reappearance, and the disturbing information about Project Helix. She didn't share every detail, maintaining operational security out of deeply ingrained habit, but she gave him enough to understand the gravity of what they were facing. Derek listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly serious as the implications became clear. "Targeted biological weapons?" he said finally, his voice hushed. That's beyond illegal. It violates every international convention on warfare." "Which is why it was hidden behind multiple layers of secrecy," Margaret replied. "According to David's information, even most of the scientists involved didn't understand the full scope of what they were creating. And now they're restarting the program." Derek ran a hand through his hair, visibly processing the enormity of the situation. "What's your plan?" "I need to verify David's information first," Margaret said. "Then find out who's connected to Project Helix and how far up the authorization goes. That's not something you can do from library databases." "No," she agreed. "It's not." Derek studied her face for a moment. "You're going back in, aren't you? Back into that world." "I don't have a choice. If David's information is accurate, this goes beyond personal history. Project Helix is a fundamental violation of everything I spent my career trying to protect." "You do have a choice," Derek countered. "You could take this to the press, to Congress, to international authorities." Margaret shook her head. "Without hard evidence, it would be dismissed as the ravings of a delusional old woman. And even with evidence, there's no guarantee it would. Reach the right people before those involved shut it down and disappeared the proof. So what's the alternative? You single-handedly investigate and expose a black-budget government program?" At 71? There was no condescension in his tone, only genuine concern, but Margaret still felt a flash of indignation. "Age is just a number, Derek. Experience never expires." She straightened in her chair, years seeming to fall away as her voice took on the quiet authority that had once commanded international operations. I spent decades developing the skills to uncover exactly this kind of operation. The fact that I've been organizing library collections for 15 years doesn't mean I've forgotten how to follow information to its source. Derek held up his hands in a gesture of surrender. I didn't mean to imply you couldn't do it. I just meant you shouldn't have to do it alone. What are you suggesting? A partnership, he said simply. You have the operational experience and institutional knowledge. I have technical skills that have evolved with modern systems. Together, we might actually have a chance of exposing Project Helix without getting ourselves killed in the process. Margaret considered his offer. The rational part of her mind, the part trained in risk assessment and operational security, screamed that involving Derek further was dangerous and unnecessary. But another part, the part that recognized how much the world had changed in 20 years, acknowledged that his skills might be essential. If we do this, she said, finally, we do it my way. That means complete compartmentalization of information, strict communication protocols, and absolute deniability for you if things go wrong. Agreed, Derek said without hesitation. Where do we start? Margaret rose and retrieved the data. Drive from its hiding place. We start by analyzing everything David collected. Then we build a secure communication channel to contact him for more information. As they began working, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in decades, the focused clarity that came with having a mission, a purpose beyond they. Every day, the librarian's life she had built was comfortable and meaningful in its way, but it had never fully engaged the analytical brilliance that had once made her legendary within intelligence circles. For the first time in years, Margaret Winters was fully awake, her mind working at the capacity it had been designed for. The transformation was visible, her posture straightening, her movements becoming more precise, her eyes sharpening with intellectual focus. Derek noticed the change. You know, he said as they set up secure communication protocols, for someone supposedly 20 years out of practice, you're remarkably current on operational security measures. Margaret allowed herself a small smile. I may have maintained certain skills over the years, just in case. The monthly trips to the shooting range weren't just for senior self-defense classes, were they? Her smile widened slightly. A woman my age can never be too careful. As they worked through the night, analyzing data and establishing secure channels, Margaret reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. From promising young intelligence recruit, to seasoned field operative, to systems designer, to retired librarian, and now, perhaps to her most important role yet, whistleblower against a program that violated everything she believed in. The symposium documentation lay forgotten on her desk, the digital archives project suddenly insignificant compared to the task before her. Director Crawford would be disappointed, perhaps even angry, but Margaret found she couldn't summon much concern for library politics anymore. Some battles were worth fighting, some weren't. And sometimes, the most important battles found you when you least expected them. Dawn was breaking when they finally had a secure channel established, a complex arrangement involving multiple encryption layers and anonymizing protocols that would allow them to contact David without revealing their location. Ready? Derek asked, his eyes red-rimmed from hours of continuous work, but his expression determined. Margaret nodded, feeling a calm certainty settle over her. 20 years ago, she had walked away from this world, believing her time for making a difference had passed. Now she understood that some callings never truly released their hold. She was Margaret Winters, 71-year-old librarian. But she was also Margaret Winters, intelligence operative, system designer, guardian of information integrity. And it was time, perhaps past time, for her to remind the world of that fact. I'm ready, she said. her voice steady as she typed the message that would bring her fully back into the shadow world she had left behind. Some battles choose us, Derek. We just have to be brave enough to fight them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.